Hi everyone, I'm Samira and
I'm Alex.
we are members of the cohort currently ongoing in Toronto that's put together by Antler VC. Before I let you introduce yourself more thoroughly, just to give you an overview of what Antler is, Antler defines itself as a global VC firm that invests in early stage startups, like super early stage, like pre-idea almost. And their whole mode is they want to find exceptional founders and put them together in this 10-week residency, in-person residency. And hopefully like people come to find their co-founders, gain convictions on an idea, and work towards pitching to an investment committee at the end where they choose whether they will invest in the company essentially or not. So we are starting week 5 of this 10-week program. And there's also another deadline, which is week 7. There is going to be a portion of the cohort that unfortunately gets cut if it's just obvious that they're not making traction towards having something pitchable by the 10th week. Am I missing anything, Alex?
No, I think that's, pretty comprehensive.
Okay. Alex, do you want to tell us about yourself and how you find yourself at Antler?
Sure. So my name is Alex Ruddock. I grew up in Toronto. I have a degree in computer science and molecular biology. I also studied some neuroscience. I went into product marketing and product management. So my sort of job life has been owning the product life cycle from start to finish. And how do I find myself here? Well, my old company got acquired in December of last year. And so it was time for me to transition. And I've always wanted to start a business. So that's why I'm here.
Is this your first? No, you had a clothing brand that you created during COVID, you said?
Yeah, that's true. So me and a friend spun up a Shopify store during COVID. We wanted to sell clothes and we wanted to donate the proceeds to the pandemic relief. So we created a brand called Homebody, naturally because everybody was at home.
Right.
And we sold a bunch of sweaters. And I think we ended up donating something like $5,000 to COVID relief, which is pretty cool. And then I have one other sort of pseudo venture. I make music.
Right.
And so I've created 6 different albums of music and performed some of them. But that's
very cool.
Very much just on the side.
Is music like your dream goal, like becoming a big musician?
That's a good question. I mean, maybe back in the day, yes. Okay. These days, not so much, but it's just been a hobby for a long time. Mm-hmm. And I mean, I like to think I'm pretty good at it, but who knows?
You posted your Spotify link in the Slack.
Yeah.
And, I checked it out, and so did other members of the cohort. And it's very good.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, people had been asking about it. I think I mentioned it during my intro slide.
Yeah.
And so people were like, hey, like you make music, like you should share it. And I was like, oh, okay, fine. I'll throw it in the Slack. So
I'll put the link in this podcast so that the 300 viewers that listen to this can check it out.
Cool.
But it's so important to have hobbies, right? I feel like I find it increasingly hard to like adopt hobbies, like just for the sake of it, because everyone says have a hobby. Mm-hmm. But I guess maybe podcasting and doing this type of YouTube content is something that I'm doing outside of just like thinking about creating a startup that's helping balance things a bit more.
Yeah. So I don't know. I feel like if you're going to do a hobby, it has to be something that it sparks natural curiosity. If it doesn't, then you'll probably not want to come back to it over and over again. Like for me, music is a hobby because it just feels like every time you like peel a layer back, there's more to learn, whether it's theory or production or, mixing, mastering, all that stuff. So, it's a very rich mine, sort of fertile ground for new ideas and exploration and stuff like that. So, yeah.
Did it ever feel like work, like when you were taking it seriously? I wonder what's your take on people who say that work, anything that becomes work will always essentially be like not enjoyable all the time. But then there's people like Naval, for instance, who, you know Naval, right? He's pretty prominent in tech Twitter and online, and he created AirChat. And someone asked him about his work-life balance, and he said there's no such thing for him because he really enjoys his work. So what's your perspective on that?
Yeah, good question. Well, I think when I make music, there's a period of pure kind of fun and creation.
Mm-hmm.
And then as soon as I have to put out an album, I've given myself a deadline, then it's work. It's spending, 30 hours figuring out how to mix a song the way I want it to, or getting album artwork together, or finding a venue to play at, or, all those things. So that's work, but it's fun, because you get to share something with the world. It's a lot like launching a product. In some ways. There's that lead up, there's the marketing plan, go-to-market strategy, all that stuff. And yeah, I mean, it's always fun. Launch day is always fun. And the lead up can be a bit stressful, but I generally find it fun. In terms of work-life balance, like, I don't know, Jeff Bezos says it's a circle. So the stuff that you do that's not work feeds into your ability to do work and vice versa. I buy into that. I think you want to find a way to do both. And sometimes you'll be way more focused on the work stuff. And sometimes you'll be way more focused on the life stuff. Like maybe there's a wedding or a crisis or whatever. But ideally, in the end, you find a way to do both and are energized by both. Yeah.
That makes sense. To bring it back to Antler, what's been your experience so far? We're halfway through. 5th week is about to start. Yeah. What has been your general experience?
I mean, it's kind of crazy that we're already on week 5. It does feel as though no time has passed. But when I look back, a lot has happened.
Yeah.
In the first week, we were basically doing icebreakers, and everybody was sharing their idea with everybody else. And there was a mad scramble to figure out A, everybody's name, B, everybody's sort of specialization, and C, what everybody wanted to work on.
Yeah.
And so I don't know about other people, but I kind of compiled a database and then was taking notes.
Did you actually compile a system of organization?
Yeah.
I remember they alluded to past founders that did well creating these databases. So you did that.
It was helpful.
On Airtable? Or?
No, I just used a Google Sheet.
Okay, nice.
Yeah, I'm a big Google Sheet guy. But yeah, I thought that was super helpful just because like you have to meet everybody in order to know what the what the options are.
You know what just occurred to me? You've watched Mean Girls, right? Where they have a burn
long
book.
time ago, yeah.
She has a burn book, right? And I'm just imagining like this database you created or like people have created, like it just like gets shared. So you found your team essentially, the people that you've been working pretty closely with. I would say like since the 2nd week, right? Or even earlier.
I'd say that going into week 3, I had a pretty good idea of who I wanted to work with.
Okay.
And then by Tuesday of week 3, we were in a room and we basically didn't leave that room for 2 weeks.
That's so good.
Yeah, it worked out really nicely. I mean, I'm lucky enough to have 2 co-founders who are A, super smart, super motivated, but B, are also highly knowledgeable in the field that we want to build in. And so in week 1, a lot of the stuff that we worked on was just knowledge transfer. Like we wanted to make sure that we were all sort of on the same page, speaking the same language. So we talked a lot about fintech. We talked a lot about climate tech. We talked a lot about just AI and sort of things like that. And we've now done over 20 calls with different people. So we've talked to VCs, we've talked to CEOs, we've talked to people in the finance department, people in climate, and we sort of ended up in a fintech space, which I think is good because that means that we've got pretty good founder market fit with James and Sunshit. And yeah, it's exciting. It's super exciting.
Do you want to tell us what your idea is, or is it in stealth mode?
No, I'm happy to share the basics. Yeah, like we started from a pretty simple premise, which was like, we knew we wanted to do a fintech, but we weren't sure like which aspect we wanted to cover. Initially, we were pretty ambitious and we were like, oh, we'll become a payments company. But in order to become a payments company, you have to have a banking partnership. In order to get a banking partnership, you have to have traction, a certain number of customers, a certain amount of capital. So yeah, becoming a payments company on day 1, nobody's going to do that. Like maybe a few years ago that was possible, but it's not possible anymore. So where that left us was thinking pretty hard about what are the things in the finance department that are still painful. And one of the big ones is reconciliation. So for those who don't know, reconciliation is, essentially checking in every once in a while and confirming that the things you thought you paid, you actually paid, and the things you thought you received, you actually received. And that, everything in your bank statement matches everything in your general ledger, which matches your receivables and your payables and blah, blah, blah. So it's, for a lot of people, it's still pretty manual, pretty painful. And the same is true for like FP&A. So if you're planning your finances, if you're trying to figure out, runway or spending, it's still pretty manual for most finance departments. Like they have these really great Excel models that, they might have a QuickBooks or a Xero, but it's not automated anywhere near as much as it could be. And so there's all kinds of sort of niches in the world of fintech, right? There's people who are doing e-commerce in multiple countries and they have multiple bank accounts, multiple ledgers. Yeah. They've got, to accept, payments in different currencies. They've got warehousing in different places. They might have installation partners. So it's a pretty complicated structure just for like a small e-commerce setup, right? And so for them, like they can definitely use things that help them automate. But then you can also sort of go all the way to the other side and think about really high transaction volumes. So anybody who's processing crazy amounts of payments every day, they also need to do recon. And so, yeah, we've talked to enough people that we understand that this is a problem that's pretty widespread. I think the question that we're trying to answer right now is, what's our niche? And how do we price it? Right? It's like we're pretty sure that we can build the thing, but the question is like, who are we building it for first and how much they're going to pay? Long term, though, this is just an approach that gets us into the finance department. Once we're there, we want to basically automate everything. So we want to build a digital CFO. We want to build a brain for the finance department. So we want to build the connective tissue, i.e. the integrations. And then we want to build the intelligence layer or the cortex that sits on top. So that at any point in time, you can basically ask a question of this AI and you can say like, hey, if we make 2 hires this month, like what is our burn going to be? Or has our largest client paid us yet? Or, we've been moving money around between 25 entities. Where's the money?
That's super interesting and quite a lot, right? Do you ever feel overwhelmed with like the goals you have set out to achieve? Or does it come back to like building the most, building an MVP first and then thinking about those things at the end? But does it ever happen to you where I start to get excited about something and I have visions of what it could be? And then there's elements in reality, like, why could you do it when there's like existing companies or people with way more money and resources? How do you deal with those thoughts? Yeah,
that's a really good question. I mean, generally speaking, I like to work in sprints. So I try to set goals that are 2 weeks out. And I try never to take on a project that's more than 10 weeks long. If it is, it's just too long. So
you took on Antler. Just kidding.
No, that's
different.
Yeah. The goal for that 10 weeks is to get the $150,000, right? So it's a pretty, clear, well-defined 10-week sprint, kind of broken up into 2-week increments. And the first 2 weeks was find a team. The second 2 weeks was apply to YC. So we're doing that today.
Your team is like everyone's technical in your team.
Yeah, we all have computer science backgrounds. Well, actually, technically, Sanjit's a mechanical engineer, but yeah.
Okay, so you guys all have engineering backgrounds or computer science. So you're a pretty like technical heavy team. I know you have multiple skills, right? But have you thought about, has anyone like has the Antler team been like, hey, you guys maybe you should get a business partner or something?
Yeah, well, I mean, at the end of the day, like we've all done business.
Okay, that's fair.
Like each of us has grown up in an entrepreneurial family.
That's true.
So the principles and the milieu of entrepreneurship and business have been like, we've all kind of been in that petri dish our entire lives. So yeah, in some ways business is kind of like second nature. It's the family business, in other words. But in terms of who's actually got experience doing sales, marketing, product, customer success, support, finance, pricing, all that stuff, James has got a fair bit because he's a prior founder. He's been a CEO before. He's run a company as an operations guy, as a lead architect, as a CEO. So yeah, I think he's pretty experienced. Sunny's been working on the sort of engineering side.
That's what you nicknamed him now?
Yeah.
Okay, Sunny.
He's been working on the engineering side for a long time, and he's a super proficient dev, really, really smart guy. But again, like is on the board of his mom's charity,
Okay.
or I think it's an NGO, and like they're pretty well-rounded tech people.
Okay.
They're not like they have they're call it T-shaped, but they're pretty skilled across a lot of domains. And then for me, like I did computer science, but I've spent the last 5 years embedded at the very core of a business, running marketing, product, customer success, professional services. Like I've basically been doing all of it.
Yeah.
I've been on hundreds of sales calls. I've demoed to the largest like tech companies on earth. I've been pretty embedded in that world for a long time. So.
All right, you've addressed my doubts. Yes, I will. I will fund you. Okay, that's cool. So before we actually move on to doing an overview of the programming that happened last week in Antler in week 4, perhaps I'll share my experience of finding a co-founder within this cohort. So I'm super happy that you found people that it seems like you want to work with for the long term, because you're also applying for YC now. So that's amazing. And you have this idea or field that you feel good about working in for the next 7 years potentially.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm so jealous. So I found a co-founder in the cohort not last week, the week prior on the Friday. We thought that she was actually in the first couple episodes of this podcast. So we had overlapping interests. We thought we would tackle similar problem domains. And we did that. We tested out 2 hypotheses, basically. One had to do with food and nutrition and people that have allergies. And you gave me a contact to do a customer discovery call on that, which was super helpful. Basically, we had formed a hypothesis and we invalidated it. And then in that process, we're like, oh, we have to do so many customer discovery calls. There should be a better system for organizing this thing. And then, I don't know if you were there on Tuesday when we pitched it. No, you weren't, right? You guys came in super late. So you don't know we worked on this, right? Really?
Yeah, only based on some of our prior conversations, but we never saw the pitch.
Here's the pitch.
Okay.
It would be Gong, but for customer discovery.
Okay.
Really. So there needs to, all founders right now, and we spoke to 8 people in one day in the cohort, they have to create their own custom systems if they are doing customer discovery calls and plug it in. For instance, you said you did about 20 customer discovery calls.
Yep.
Where does all that data sit?
Yeah, it's a great question. We originally had a very ad hoc system, so we were just jumping on Teams calls and taking notes. Pretty quickly, we're like, all right, we know we're working together. We know we're doing calls with people. We have to make a more advanced system. Right. And so our setup right now is we have Notion for, call it unstructured data. We've got Airtable for structured data. We've got Firefly's AI for note taking.
Okay.
And essentially, Firefly's it takes decent summaries, but it's more just a system of record.
Right.
And then we pipe content from there into Notion, and then we use that to inform the sort of relational database setup that we've got in Airtable. And so that's kind of how we're doing it. When I was working as a product manager, though, discovery is something that you do all the time.
Yeah.
And we used a bunch of different systems for it, but one of the big ones was just getting people to take surveys. We had a discussion forum that we got people into. People could get points and rewards for actually providing their feedback. So that was a really good system. And then we had Gong at the company. So we would listen to people's calls after the fact.
By the way, Gong is a intelligent sales platform, essentially, that gives you insights.
Yeah, it's basically a call recording platform, and it uses some AI to basically tag different keywords in the conversation. So as a sales rep, you can watch your calls back. As a coach of a sales rep, you can watch the call and be like, hey, you didn't talk about the thing you were supposed to talk about, or you never followed up with this person or whatever.
Someone told me that in their previous company, product managers had to fight to get Gong access, and they really wanted it. There was a really strong, burning desire to possess this tool.
Totally. I mean, if you've been on any customer calls, you know that you're always going to walk away with a learning. There's always something that somebody says and you kind of go like, wait, sorry, say that one more time. What do you mean by that? Like, why is that so difficult? Or, what is the sort of structure of the organization that makes it so that you can't do this? Like, what's the security blocker there? So I think the more customer calls you've been on, the more you realize how valuable they are.
Yeah.
But the problem is that you can't be on every single call.
Yeah.
And so there's this kind of ideal, which is like, imagine every call was recorded, perfectly summarized, all the patterns were extracted, and then I could just show up and look at all the patterns and go, amazing, like product roadmap, check, solved. Doesn't really work that way. Like no one's cracked that yet. Gong is one of the tools that you use.
Is it fairly recent that Gong launched, or did they pivot to AI?
They're around for about 5 years, I think.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, they're one of the SaaS darlings. Like they've been around for a little while like them.
Right.
Chorus is also a call recording company. And then some of the newer ones are like Otter and Fireflies, but they're more for like note-taking, not as much for like sales stuff.
I find Otter is like one of those aspirational tools where you're like, oh, I'm going to use this and I'm going to be so efficient and I'm going to use the next actions that it generates for me. But I end up recording these calls and then never going back to them. I think I've been like trying to think more deeply about AI generated summaries versus you doing it yourself. And it feels like there's something about it that just doesn't make it the same when you are the person in the call, not like, I think it's helpful for other calls, right? So you get the gist of what everyone else is doing. But for myself, I still don't learn when the AI is generating the summaries for me. Have you thought about that? Like, what is the thing that makes it?
So as someone who's studied neuroscience, I think about this a lot because on the one hand, AI is this great shortcut. For a lot of things. You can either have it take a lot of information and condense it, or take a small amount of information and expand it. You can look for patterns, you can structure things, you can write code. So it's really powerful. But if you don't take the time to really process what it is that you're thinking about reading, writing, etc., then it may not stick in your brain. Like you may not be laying down the tracks and then like sort of like, the synaptic connections that you need to then come back to it quickly or easily, right? And so because
the brain is still the most intelligent computer there is, right? Like the way it works, like we can't even predict. Like you just said, like you do this call, you gain these insights, and then some random time in the future, like it's gonna like pop up in the most relevant time to like build on something else and then give you this like super unique insight about something, right?
Yeah. No, the brain is, I mean, it's crazy. Like we understand it and we don't understand it at the same time. But one of the things that we know based on experimentation is, for example, if you want someone to remember something better, you can have them type notes or you can have them write notes by hand. Typically writing notes by hand yields better results. Right. And so what that suggests is there's something about maybe writing more slowly, not going as fast, which is tied to memory. And that kind of makes sense, right? Because when you're typing, you can go backwards and forwards very, very quickly. Like typing the wrong sentence is it's low effort to fix it. When you're writing something by hand, you're a little bit more conscious about not making a mistake. And it could be that sort of meta process, that fear of writing the wrong thing, forces you to think critically while you write, as opposed to like while you type, you don't have to do that.
It's more of a process when you're typing, like almost a thing you can unconsciously do. I just remember back in lectures, you can actually not be there and just transcribe what someone tells you, like in a courtroom. But if you're writing it, since you can't just transcribe, like you can't engage in that activity, you have to be like, what is the central point of what they're saying? How does it tie to everything else? So I think there's something there, like generally speaking, and this is true for anything that anybody does. If you really want to understand something, you need to give yourself the time to sit with it. And you need to give yourself the reps to truly understand it. So like the way that memory is formed typically is over time through repetition. And that's why like when you're in school, you don't just learn the whole textbook on day one. It's like you learn a unit,
you review the unit, you take a test, and then you move on to the next unit.
Testing is also a central component, right?
Definitely. Yeah. I think testing is super important because you don't really know how well you know something until you have to answer questions about it.
Yeah.
And a test is in some ways just a function of basically saying hey, can you teach this material? Either you can do it and you can do it correctly and you can explain how to do it to the point where someone else can say whether or not you did it correctly, or you can't. And if you can't, then you probably don't understand something well enough, or at least at the level where you'd be able to teach it. So if you want to learn something really well, teach it. If you can't teach it, do a test. If you can't do a test.
The teaching thing is the Feynman technique, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. If you can't explain it simply, you don't understand it well enough.
How about this perspective? In the past, when I used to read nonfiction, I would be if I don't take notes and I don't remember it, then it essentially has been wasted time. But more recently, throughout the last year when I practiced more yoga and meditation and started reading more about how the unconscious mind operates, I've kind of shifted my perspective on, perhaps it's not applicable to science and math and formulas, but the other stuff that's more that sets your perspective on life or gives you whatever, right? I've realized that even if I don't remember it, I can't pass a recall memory test, it doesn't mean that it's not influencing my views of the world going forward or how I look at problems or whatever.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, the way that I think about the brain is it has to be able to forget things.
Yes.
But at the same time, it sometimes learns things and you don't even know that it's learned them.
That's so true.
And so you have to trust that this thing that you have some control over, but not complete control over, is doing garbage collection the right way. It's like a language that does garbage collection, like Java or something, right? It's gonna remove things for you without you asking for it. And you just have to hope that it removes the right things. But there's something to be said for quality over quantity. So, for example, you could read 30 books at the same time, or you could read one book at the same time. And chances are you'll get a lot more out of that single book if you are entirely focused on
That's
it
true.
than if you try to read 30 and you're reading one page.
But in a world where there's infinite knowledge, what is one to do? Because I see the desire to read lots. I know people who listen to audiobooks at 2x and listen to them all the time.
Yeah.
So I think they get a breath. I guess, is it the question of breath or depth? And maybe there is no right answer, or what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's so many different learning hacks. But I say, generally speaking, that you spend the first, call it 22 years of your life building the foundation upon which everything else will sit. So if you don't learn math in that first 22 years, then a lot of knowledge is not going to be accessible to you. If you don't learn a language in those first 22 years, you're not going to be able to read and acquire new knowledge. And so I think there are, foundational skills that you develop as a young person that then allow you as an older person to explore things that you would find hard to explore otherwise. So call that point number one.
It's a bit sad, because we don't have a lot of freedom or intention as we grow up, right? We're just kind of influenced by our parents, our external circumstances, and then that sets the foundation for the rest of your life.
Yeah, no, very much so.
In your second point, sorry, I interrupted you.
Totally fine. Point number two is, I think there are all kinds of learning hacks, right? So, for example, I know this guy he's posted about trying to learn as much as possible as quickly as possible, and he has a method for doing this. The method is basically watch lectures on 2x speed and then just do practice problems. And then at the end of a week or the end of 2 weeks, take an exam and see how you did. That's an interesting system because part of it is just exposing the brain to concepts early enough so that it has time to sleep on them and form connections, right? It's like how a neural network, in order for it to be successful, it actually needs to kind of go to sleep. Okay. So there's sort of the training process, and then there's kind of the refinement process, or the consolidation phase, you could call it, right? And it's the same with humans. We do stuff when we're awake, we absorb a bunch, then we fall asleep, and then we prune and kind of make connections and dream and stuff, and then we wake up and we're okay, I've got new knowledge or whatever.
So sleeping is actually the biggest learning hack.
Yeah, absolutely. I think if you can get good sleep, you'll you'll be way further ahead than most people. Like, eat your omega-3s, get lots of sleep, exercise. Like I think exercise is the only thing that basically promotes neurogenesis.
Oh, interesting.
So if you're not doing cardio, you're basically not creating neurons. Don't quote me on that, but that's essentially, I think, the commonly held belief. Yeah.
Okay, interesting. Wow, we really went into the brain and neuroscience. Okay, actually, last question on this topic, since you do have a background in computer science and neuroscience. So if we still understand the importance of like critical thinking, coming to conclusions yourself, and like your brain essentially having to be active and involved in the learning process, how can AI help us in a way that's more meaningful? Because like I said, Otter and these note transcription things, they don't really help with my individual learning, right? And some other interesting thing, I guess Otter gives me like an insurance that if I have this like 45 minutes conversation with you, immediately after I can probably only recall 3 things. So I'm like, oh, if I want to go back, then I can go back. But at the same time, I won't go back because no one has time for that in life. And then I'll remember some other part of the conversation some other time in the future. But anyhow, how do you see AI actually helping us with learning?
Yeah, I mean, I've thought about this a lot. I think AI does 2 things right now. It allows you to delegate certain things that you maybe don't want to spend time on. And if you're ultra low skill at something, it allows you to be kind of average skill at it. So like if you can't write an essay in English, but you can just about form a prompt, you can get an entire essay in English, right? Even though you could not do that yourself, like you can create that. With a prompt, you can get to working Python code. You may not be a programmer, but you can still get that. So it's like if your skill was here, suddenly your skill is here, right? And you can get that without really doing anything. So that's cool. But that just means that everybody's kind of being pulled up from a lower skill level to a sort of called mid-tier, like lower mid-tier skill level. I think if you're highly skilled at something, but you don't have time to do kind of an ancillary task, then again, AI can help you solve that problem where it's like, summarize this meeting, send the summary to somebody in an email. I don't have time for that right now.
I see.
Like you can see how there might be use cases like that. Or even when you're coding, if you're a really skilled programmer, you can still get AI to write code for you that's pretty good, especially if you're using like Copilot or something. So let's say you're like writing a bunch of APIs, right? I've written like 3, like JS files, right, for my Node API. I have to write 10 more. The patterns that I used over here are probably going to appear over here. And so if you've used Copilot, you know that it can actually read these files and it'll start to give you like autocompletes for these files. And if you write the first 5, the next 5 are going to be, in theory, like twice as fast. Right? And so I think it
takes off the rote work. So it's not really your learning that it's replacing, it's your efficiency.
Totally. So learning is a really interesting thing because we've talked about it a bit already today. Like you have to kind of be tested on stuff. You have to go slow. And so I think that AI, if it's going to be used as a tool for learning, has to be willing to actually test your knowledge, right? Like if I just type prompts into ChatGPT and ChatGPT tells me something and I read it, that's great. But that doesn't necessarily mean that I understand it. That doesn't necessarily mean that I'm going to remember it. If instead what happened was I typed a bunch of prompts into ChatGPT, read a bunch of stuff, and then at the end, ChatGPT was like, okay, we've talked about this, and this today, but how well do you understand this? Let me quiz you. Here's a quick quiz. Or let's actually dive deeper on this topic because you asked me 5 questions about it. What did you actually learn? Right? And so you can kind of have these discussions that help to solidify some of those learnings, some of those concepts. One of the other things that I think is really interesting about AI, and we talked about this a little bit in the design sprint a few weeks ago, was like, okay, maybe when I'm trying to understand a concept, reading it is not the shortest path. So I think mathematics is like a really good example for this, right? If all you did was read formulas, but you never saw a graph, calculus would only be so interesting. Like you could only understand it so well without seeing a visual. That's why you take functions first You learn how lines
I'm
work.
just getting like
And then
flashbacks
you do calculus.
to calculus
Yeah.
and university. I was like, without the graphs, I would have probably got 25% in the class.
Yeah, the graphs help. Like, they're very helpful. Sometimes you need a visual aid.
All right. We have only like a few more minutes before you have to run to a meeting. So I'm going to stir us back into startups, like an Antler more concretely. So I was going to give an overview of our programming that we did last week. Okay, so to give an overview of the programming that happened at Antler last week and then share our learnings from that, I'm going to take a few moments. So last week was pretty light on programming because there was a conference in the middle for 2 days and the majority of the cohort went to that. So beyond the conference, which was called Discovery X in Ontario, we also had a town hall. We do this regularly on Tuesdays where the cohort basically gives feedback on the previous week and then the program manager basically shares everything. It's just like a town hall, like a company town hall or an all hands. We also had Tuesday pitches where people who had formed teams by like finding their co-founders so far, they pitched their ideas in like 4-minute spurts, and then the audience also asked questions, the audience being the rest of the cohort. And then we had a partner office hour as well where it was more casual. We just came and asked questions. And then, that was basically it. That was the programming. What stood out to you from the programming? I know you guys pitched for the first time your own idea on the Tuesday pitch. Yeah.
Yep. What stood out as far as the programming? I mean, I'm going to be honest, like, we were super heads down last week.
Okay.
We were putting in easily 10-hour days every day. So I would be in at like 8 a.m. and I wouldn't leave until like 9:30 a lot of the time. So that's, it's quite a bit of...
Question, how do you sustain your energy and focus when you're doing that so much?
That's a great question.
You're just made like that?
No, not necessarily. I think it's more that the topic is interesting enough. Like, there's enough to do. It sates both curiosity, but it's also hard. It's not easy.
Okay.
But you have a team as well,
right.
So the team dynamic helps a bit.
The social component.
Yeah. But yeah, to answer your question, do I have any learnings from last week? Well, we wanted to get a pitch deck together. Mm-hmm. So one of the big learnings was, okay, we have all these ideas, but we have to put it together into a story. Mm-hmm. So we actually had a meeting with Bijan last week. Okay. And we showed him the pitch deck. And we're like, what do you think? He's like, this is a collection of ideas and, like solutions, but I don't get the narrative. Like, I don't understand how you get from point A to point B to point C to Z, right?
Which is so important. It seems like, at least in the venture world or startup world, like having a narrative or a compelling story.
Totally.
It's so funny how like that's one of the things the investors emphasize during the panels in the conference too. They're like, have a compelling narrative.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, like, humans are storytelling creatures.
That's true.
So you have to frame everything as a story if you want people to remember it. Mm-hmm. And one of the things I've always learned is that the emotional, lead with the emotion, follow with the facts.
Right.
You'll hook somebody with the emotional piece, and then you'll convince them even further with the facts.
Have you heard that saying that you convince people actually through the emotions, and then they use the facts to justify their decision?
That's true.
So you're convincing them, and then the facts are like, here, if you want to still seem like a rational animal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I think in the world of VC, there's a couple things that are super important. The first thing that you have to communicate to them is like where you are today, right? Yes. If you don't have a good understanding of where you are today, that means you don't understand the market, you don't understand the competition, you don't understand the available solutions, you haven't done any feasibility analysis on the product, then all that signals to them is that you're not ready to take step 2, right? So if you haven't done that initial analysis, if you aren't super clear on ground truth, if you aren't an expert in the space, and that becomes apparent, either because your pitch makes it apparent or because in the Q&A after your pitch it makes it apparent, the whole thing falls apart.
Yeah.
Right? So step number 1 is like, you really have to understand the space that you're playing in.
Which is also fair to expect from people because VCs are constantly being pitched by sometimes swindlers are like people who just want their money and are not actually interested in creating a legitimate product or even that passionate about innovation or tech or startups, right? So they're constantly being pitched by all types and hordes of people, and they have to like learn how to distill who's legitimate from who's like, just faking it.
100%. Yeah. And sometimes there'll be an expert on the space and they'll sniff out that you're not an expert really quickly.
Which is so interesting. Like, I think Naaman, who's an expert, he was the founder of Flight Network. So he's an expert when it comes to travel. They've never funded a travel company, right? And then same with this woman I met at the conference. She had her domain of expertise and she was an angel investor. And she has never invested in that domain. So sometimes I think a hack also to like convince investors is like, it has to be something that's so like domain specific to you that no one else can like essentially confidently refute you and say, you don't know this is actually, because right now Naaman, bring up anything, he knows so much about the industry that it's impossible to like convince him with like a unique insight that no, what I'm doing is different.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, or it's like in those meetings, you have to tell them something that they don't know.
Yes.
And that can be hard for an expert.
Yeah.
Right. Like sometimes in order to do that, you need to be fresh out of a Stanford AI lab.
Right.
And be like, this paper, nobody knows this is possible because it only just became possible and I only just published it.
Right.
Sometimes you need that level of kind of like call it unique insight or call it IP, whatever you want. Like, and so I think, I think if you're pitching to a VC, obviously they want to know a bit about your background because they're going to use your historical milestones to predict your future milestones. They want to know that you know the market. They want to know that, or when you're pitching, you have to tell a story because you're essentially hanging things off of a lattice, right? So it's like premise number 1, premise number 2, premise number 3. And even though you think that premises 1, 2, and 3 are not possible, I'm going to tell you why they are possible. Here's premise 4 that kind of like addresses your doubts on premises 1, 2, 3. There's going to be an emotional arc to this, right? So it's going to hit emotionally. You're going to remember the pitch. It's not just going to be like numbers on a screen that you forget in 10 minutes. And then I think you have to have a really compelling vision. And the vision is very closely tied to the sort of like call it the addressable market, right? Yeah. So for us, our vision is to build a digital CFO, right? That's pretty interesting because it's totally possible in theory, right? There's no reason that you couldn't get your financial advice from an AI, right? It's fundamentally just a question of like, how much money do we have? Where's the money? What can we reasonably spend more money on? It's like, it doesn't have to be overly complicated, but there's a lot of nuance, right? Like you probably want to understand tax law. You probably want to understand benefits. Like there's all these other components of knowledge. Anyway, so like that's our vision, but we have to tell the story for how to get there.
So the office hour, did you have it after your Tuesday pitch or before? So you honed your pitch after?
I think it was after.
Okay.
Yeah. So we chatted with Bijan and now we've reworked the entire pitch deck.
Are you thinking of pitching again on Tuesday?
Yeah, I think we will. Yeah, you guys will hear the update on tomorrow. Yeah.
Okay, maybe I'll record a little bit of the pitch and share it. So you have to run, and unfortunately this is much shorter than I want it to be. I want to like literally continue talking to you for the next hour, and we didn't really touch too much on, we got sidetracked a bit, but perhaps you'll be a repeat guest in the future and we can continue our conversation.
Yeah, I love talking, so anytime.
And you're very knowledgeable, obviously. You have really interesting insights, and I've learned a lot.
Cool, thank you.
So yeah, thank you for doing this, and we're going to start week 5, and it's going to be crazy. All right, thanks for tuning in. See you guys next week.